everybody, this is Albert with Green Tea House. I hope you're doing well today. Today we're going to do the second part of this series on factors that affect caffeine in Camellia sinensis, otherwise known as the tea plant. Now before we begin, if you haven't done so already, please come and check us out here in New Braunfels, Texas, if you haven't done so already. And if you have done so already, thank you for coming. Also subscribe and hit the notification bell so these episodes come fresh to you and post a comment. Caffeine is very important. 90% of the world consumes caffeine on a given day. That's what the estimates show. We've talked about previously how the caffeine is affected in the body differently from coffee than it is for tea. But go to part one on that episode so we don't flesh it out more. This one's going to be straight to the continuation. So part one, important things to understand. Is the tea plant the Assamica variety or is it the China Bush variety? Also, you're looking at fertilizer. You're looking at where in the tea plant is it coming from. Now, 3 out of the 4 today are very, very important in affecting caffeine level in tea, regardless if you're getting it from the buds, which tend to have more caffeine, or the more older mature leaves, which tend to have less caffeine. Number one, it's the amount of leaves that you're using. I mean, this is pretty obvious. The more tea leaves you're going to use, the more caffeine. The less tea leaves you're going to use, the less. We have an episode here on how East and West drinks tea differently in terms of volume. As a whole, the East tends to drink a stronger tea. And when I mean East, I don't mean like East Coast. I mean like East as in China, Japan, that area. So they'll normally do 1.5 teaspoons to even 2 teaspoons for about 6 ounces of water. We tend to do a teaspoon for maybe 8 ounces, even 10 ounces of water. So the more leaves you use, makes sense, right? Regardless if you're doing like a pu'er or an oolong, which tends to have lower caffeine, or if you're doing something like a gyokuro that tends to have higher caffeine, the more leaves you use, the more caffeine. The second one we're going to talk about is length of steeping time. The longer you steep, the more caffeine. The shorter you steep, the less. Why? Because the infusion is abbreviated if you are doing a shorter infusion time. As a whole, now there's going to be exceptions, but as a whole, the shorter the infusion, the less time that the hot water has to extract not just the caffeine, but all the phytonutrients that you find in the tea plant, including the insanely high amount of catechins. So the longer you steep, the more caffeine. Now, the longer you steep, there's also typically going to be a correlation to the amount of tannins released, to the amount of bitterness that the tea can have, especially in the more delicate teas like greens, whites, and yellows, and the lighter oolongs. If you steep a long time on a black, you can make it a little bitter. Some people like that more bitter black. But as a whole, the blacks and the pu'er have more leeway in terms of taste and in terms of bitterness than the lights. So just understand that. So if you're looking to biohack your caffeine level, then for sure steep it a long time. I mean, you don't have to do what we typically recommend, especially for the blacks and the pu'ers, a 5-minute infusion 2 times before you throw it out. I mean, you can do an 8-minute infusion, 9-minute infusion, and certainly you're going to get a lot of caffeine out. Now, if you're wanting to decaffeinate your tea, there is this idea that you could do a quick rinse, like a 1-minute rinse, and then throw that out. And I would tell you that most of the studies show that doesn't really work in terms of fully decaffeinating your tea in a natural way. There's ways to decaf your tea where they use solvents and chemicals. High-end tea, they'll use carbon dioxide, which is not toxic. But you'll see the lower-end ones, you'll see people use like methylate chloride and these chemicals to extract it. So some people want to avert that and not deal with the chemicals. So they're like, oh, I've read online that if I just quick rinse for a couple of minutes the tea and then throw that out, now then the first real infusion that I will drink will be decaffeinated. That's not true. Most studies will show that it's about 20% it'll lose its caffeine in the first rinse. So if you're looking to naturally lower the decaf levels, yeah, do a rinse, even a 5-minute rinse, and then throw it out. But you're still going to have caffeine for those of you who really want to eliminate complete caffeine. And we've talked about before how there are teas that have very low caffeine levels. So I would just stay away from all the decaf brands. The third one is going to be temperature. The hotter the temperature, the more caffeine that's going to be released. The lower the temperature, the less. Heat extracts more of the caffeine. And so this kind of goes to, well, what temperature should you be brewing the 6 categories of tea in your tisanes too? We're not talking about tisanes in this episode. We're talking about strictly the tea plant. So you know that if you've listened to this enough, or you just know about tea, that the black teas will tend to be 190 degrees or higher, depending on the black, and then same thing for pu'er. So you're looking at strongly roasted oolongs, blacks, pu'ers, you're looking at 190 to full boil. So that in itself will make more caffeine be released than if you were, let's say, to do a black or a pu'er at 175. So temperature definitely makes a difference. Temperature is also correlated to bitterness, again, going back to astringency. And look, astringency necessarily is not a bad thing. It's just a bad thing in the light teas like green, where it's like, it tastes disgusting, right? It makes you pucker up. So the hotter the temperature, the more caffeine. So if you're looking to really get a caffeine kick, then do a tea that has high caffeine, like a gyokuro or a matcha. Brew it really hot and just tolerate it and kind of drink it. Just expect it to be really bitter, but you'll get more of a caffeine hit. That's something you can do. So the fourth one is just propaganda. So what do I mean by propaganda? We've talked about this in the several history of tea episodes that we've done here, how the more, as England went away from green tea and went to black, there was this kind of idea that black tea is really the only tea and the best tea. And really, if you were to ask a typical American in 1970, at the peak of tea bag era, how many categories of tea are there? What is tea? They wouldn't even know. They could even tell you maybe 3 out of the 6 categories. And they would tell you, well, tea is English tea. It's black. They wouldn't even know it's black. They'll just say tea, there's one type of tea, which we would call black today. But there was no awareness. And a lot of this was the massive advertising that was done by Tetley and Twinings and Lipton and all these things, pushing black tea on us. And we talked about in the history of tea episode why this was, and so we're not going to spend too much time here, but black tea was pushed on us. And so part of that was this idea that black tea is the best tea. Now, when the 90s and the early noughts came around, and now we started to see more artisanal tea, and now we see green tea and white tea, and more people kind of know these names but not really know what's in them, there was still this idea that was pushed that black tea has the most caffeine. Black tea in itself does not have the most caffeine. Gyokuro matcha have more caffeine than the typical black. But there's aspects of black and how it's brewed that would make one believe that it does have the most caffeine. And what is that? Like we talked about in the first one, most black tea is made from Assam. Assam leaf has 33% more caffeine. Number 2, you steep it longer, black tea. That's going to release more caffeine. Number 3, you steep it hotter. That's going to release more caffeine as well. So all these kind of played a role in it, but you can't say strictly that black tea has the most caffeine. A lot of it has to do with where the leaves are taken from the tea plant and other factors, as we talked about in this 2-part series. Guys, post in the comments. I'd love to hear from you. Until next time, take care. God bless.